The day you begin getting rich is usually not the day it looks like it. That is one of the strangest truths in money. Most people think wealth announces itself. They imagine it arrives with a louder car, a better watch, a nicer kitchen, a more expensive vacation, a cleaner Instagram life, some visible evidence that the scoreboard has changed. They expect a feeling aglow, a little internal ceremony that says you made it. That is not how it usually happens. Real wealth often arrives so quietly that the person building it barely notices. He is too busy doing the right things. He is saving without applause. He is investing without theater. He is saying no when other people say yes. He is making 100 small, slightly unglamorous decisions that do not look rich in the moment but become rich when repeated long enough. I have spent most of my life around money, and the older I get, the less impressed I am by visible success. Visible success is often financed, it is often rented, it is often maintained by a machine that must be fed every month, or it begins making threats. Quiet wealth is different. Quiet wealth is when the machine begins feeding you. Quiet wealth is when your life stops depending quite so completely on what happens. Next Friday, quiet wealth is when the month no longer feels like a chase. Quiet wealth is when you wake up and the future does not look like something that must be negotiated all over again before breakfast. The public does not understand this because the public keeps mistaking evidence of spending for evidence of wealth. Those are not the same thing. A man can spend magnificently and still be fragile. Another can look ordinary and become difficult to hurt. I know which one I prefer. If I had to put the whole idea in one sentence, I would say it this way. The first real sign that you are getting rich is not that you can buy more things. It is that fewer things have power over you. That is a better standard. It is also a more honest one. When I was younger, I watched people who looked prosperous and assumed some of them must be. Over time, I learned that a great many people are simply maintaining an image. The image may be expensive, and expensive images impress crowds very reliably. But the private arithmetic is often ugly debt. Pressure, no cushion, no reserves, no ability to wait, no ability to say no, no ability to endure one bad quarter without emotional damage. That is not wealth. That is costume. Real wealth often looks like restraint for a long time. It looks like a couple living in a house they can comfortably afford while people around them upgrade too early. It looks like an older paid-off car beside someone else. S-finance status symbol. It looks like money quietly leaving the checking account every month and entering index funds without ceremony. It looks like refusing to compete in games whose prize is applause from people who are themselves not free. That is why I say quiet wealth is so easy to miss. It does not flatter the ego at first, it flatters the future. And most people are not trained to care about the future in a disciplined enough way. The first internal sign that you are getting rich is that enough starts becoming a clear idea. This is rarer than the public imagines. Most people do not fail financially because they earn too little. Some do, of course, and I do not insult real hardship by pretending otherwise. But among people with decent incomes, the larger problem is often that they have never defined enough. Without that definition, every raise becomes an invitation to expand rather than an opportunity to build. I have seen it endlessly. A person earns more, and almost immediately the life rises to meet the income. Better apartment, better car, better restaurants, better vacations, better furniture, better social positioning, better visible proof that the person has moved up a rung. The trouble is that the rung keeps moving. If you never define enough, you are not climbing, you are chasing. And chasing is expensive. A person who is quietly getting rich usually stops chasing before the crowd does. He decides, perhaps not with fanfare, but with clarity, that his life does not need to become larger every time his paycheck does. He stops treating every raise as a command to upgrade his identity. He starts treating part of new income as ownership fuel. This changes everything. The world calls it modesty. I call it arithmetic. Suppose two people each earn $75,000. One spends $80,000 and lives in a state of continuous explanation. The other spends $55,000 and sends the difference into reserves, retirement accounts, and productive assets. The first person may look more prosperous. The second is building options. And options are one of the finest definitions of wealth I know. The ability to wait, the ability to leave, the ability to repair, the ability to sleep, the ability to hear bad news without immediately converting it into panic. That is what the gap buys. People underestimate this because the gap is invisible. Nobody compliments you for maintaining margin. Nobody comes to dinner and says, "I admire the fact that your monthly obligations are below what your income could support." Yet that invisible gap is where freedom begins living. It is not deprivation. It is self-respect in financial form. Once a person truly understands enough, spending changes its character, purchases stop being identity statements and become trade-offs. He starts asking a much better question than "Can I afford it?" He asks, "What does this commit me to?" That question has saved more money than any coupon ever did. A large fixed cost is not one decision. It is 100 future decisions already made in advance. That is why I dislike inflation of lifestyle so much. It hardens the future. It takes years that could have remained flexible and spends them on appearances, convenience, and social proof. The person quietly getting rich starts resisting that process almost without noticing. He no longer needs every outer sign of success to move upward in step with his income. That is one of the most powerful psychological shifts in personal finance. He has stopped performing for the room. The second sign is that time starts looking more valuable than things. This is a wonderful stage because it means the mind is maturing. When people are financially insecure, they are often forced into the ugliest trade in the world. They trade enormous amounts of time, energy, and attention for every unit of money. And then when a little money finally appears, they spend it on objects, because objects are tangible proof that the trade was worth making. I understand why that happens. But once wealth begins forming quietly in the background, the calculation changes. The person starts noticing that money can buy something far more precious than another object. It can buy time back. That is a very different level of thinking. It means paying for convenience sometimes instead of maximizing every tiny savings opportunity. It means understanding that 3 extra free hours may be worth more than the satisfaction of doing everything yourself. It means refusing pointless meetings, avoiding unnecessary errands, paying for efficiency where it truly matters, and letting money remove low-value friction from life. That is not laziness. That is advanced capital allocation. When I was younger, I saw many people save themselves into exhaustion. They would spend Saturdays doing everything themselves to preserve a few dollars while losing the one asset that does not replenish. A person quietly getting rich begins respecting time in a deeper way. He sees that his best hours are not equally suited to every task. Some hours should be spent earning, some thinking, some resting, some loving the people around him, some building what only he can build. If money can remove low-value demands and protect higher-value hours, then money is doing one of its greatest jobs. The public often misses this because it worships visible sacrifice. It admires the person who looks busy, overextended, exhausted, deeply engaged in the performance of importance. Quiet wealth often rejects that performance. It starts leaving white space on the calendar. White space is underrated. White space is where thought happens. White space is where health is protected. White space is where family still gets a version of you that is not entirely used up. A calendar with room in it is a form of wealth, even if no one on social media knows how to admire it. The third sign is that emergencies stop feeling like moral failures. This is one of the cleanest dividing lines between financial fragility and financial strength. In a fragile life, every surprise feels accusatory. The car repair, the broken appliance, the medical bill, the unexpected travel. The layoff rumor, the insurance deductible, each one arrives as if life itself were prosecuting you for not being stronger. That is exhausting. And more important, it destroys judgment. A person living in that state is not making decisions from calm. He is making decisions from compression. Compression makes people short-term. It makes them reactive. It makes them choose relief over strategy again and again because relief is the only thing they can afford emotionally. That is why I care so much about buffers. A buffer is not just a pile of money in a high-yield savings account. It is psychological distance from panic. If your laptop dies and you replace it without checking whether the checking account can survive the week, that is a sign. If your company hints at layoffs and you feel concern rather than terror, that is a sign. If a normal life interruption no longer rearranges the entire emotional tone of the household, that is a sign. Quiet wealth often first appears as reduced drama. No confetti, just reduced drama. People rarely appreciate how life-changing this is because fear has often become normal to them. They assume money anxiety is just adulthood. In truth, much of it is underbuilt structure, a real emergency fund. Some reserves, a little space between income and obligation. These things do not merely improve the balance sheet, they improve the nervous system. I have long believed that wealth should make a person more rational. If it only makes him a fancier consumer, it has been used badly. A buffer does exactly that. It restores rationality. It gives you the right to solve problems in sequence instead of emotionally. It keeps a surprise from becoming a spiral. The fourth sign is that raises start changing your assets more than your lifestyle. This is one of the great silent turning points in a financial life. The first few raises often vanish because a person is still building adulthood. Fine, that is life, but eventually a fork appears. A promotion arrives, income rises 10%, 15%, maybe 20%, and the person must decide, consciously or unconsciously, whether the new money belongs mostly to the present or partly to the future. Most people hand it to the present. That is why they stay stuck. Quiet wealth begins when the opposite happens. Income rises and yet the baseline lifestyle barely moves. The rent is not dramatically upgraded. The car does not immediately become more expensive. The groceries, restaurants, and travel may improve somewhat, but not enough to consume the entire increase. A significant share of the raise is redirected into investments, reserves, and future optionality. This is what the public calls discipline. I call it the refusal to let lifestyle inflation steal compounding years. A person who earns $60,000 and lives on $45,000 is building something. If he later earns $80,000 and still lives near $48,000 or $50,000, then the machine begins accelerating in a very serious way. That additional $30,000 or so a year no longer disappears into upgraded life maintenance. It goes to assets over years. That becomes enormous. And because it becomes enormous slowly at first, people disrespect it. That is a mistake. Money accumulates where identity allows it to. A person who thinks of every raise as permission will always find something to consume it. A person who thinks of every raise as partly belonging to future ownership will build wealth almost without drama. That is why I always say the most important part of a financial plan is not a spreadsheet. It is the identity behind it. Do you see income growth as evidence that your life should look richer or as fuel that can make your future structurally stronger? That choice compounds. The fifth sign is that comparison starts losing its grip. This is one of my favorites because it marks genuine freedom. The poor mind compares continuously. Not only poor in dollars, poor in posture. It checks the neighbor's driveway. It notices the coworker's vacation. It feels the friend's renovation as a private accusation. It sees every visible act of spending as evidence that somebody else is either winning or leaving you behind. That mindset is financially poisonous. It turns other people's decisions into your problems. I've always found that comparison is the tax people volunteer to pay on not knowing their own priorities. Once you know your priorities, comparison gets weaker because most visible consumption loses its power over you. Someone else may buy the truck, the luxury apartment, the expensive school package, the destination wedding, the second home. Fine, perhaps. That suits their values, perhaps it suits their vanity, perhaps it is financed by debt they should not have taken. In either case, it does not need to alter your arithmetic. That indifference is a sign, a quiet one, but a real one. When you see somebody spend big and your first reaction is not envy but clarity, then you are changing when you no longer feel compelled to imitate every visible status move in your social circle. Then you are becoming much harder to manipulate. Marketing hates this person. So does peer pressure. So does fear of missing out. And those three forces keep a surprising number of people broke. I knew people who made perfectly decent incomes and still sabotaged themselves by treating every social comparison as a command. A friend upgraded the vehicle, so they upgraded. Another moved into a larger home, so they started browsing too. Someone posted vacation pictures. And suddenly the ordinary weekend life looked like failure. That is how adults become financially adolescent. They keep asking the room what matters instead of deciding for themselves. Quiet wealth ends that. Not because the person becomes superior, because he becomes clear, and clarity is a kind of armor. The sixth sign is that money stops being the central conversation in your head. This is a very strange stage when it first arrives. People who have spent years doing constant mental math often do not trust the silence when it begins. For a long time, every small choice was a calculation. Lunch, gas, repairs, transfers, due dates, rewards points, late fees, which account is safest to use this week, which obligation can be nudged, which stress can be postponed. That is not a life. That is vigilance necessary sometimes. Yes, healthy long-term. No, as quiet wealth builds, money begins moving backstage, not because it has become unimportant, but because the basic structure has been handled well enough that it no longer demands constant intervention. Bills are automated. Savings are automated. Investments are automated. The broad portfolio sits there doing its job. Rebalancing happens occasionally. The person is still responsible, but responsibility no longer feels like constant triage. This change is profound. Mental energy is freed. And once mental energy is freed, better questions appear. What work is worth doing? What kind of life is this actually adding up to? What relationships have I neglected? What project do I care enough about to take seriously? What kind of legacy am I quietly building? I have always been suspicious of people who talk about money all the time. Not because money is dirty, money is very important. But when it dominates thought, it usually means the system is not built yet. Good money systems become boring, and boring is one of the highest compliments I can give a financial structure. Boring money often leads to an exciting life. The reverse is also true. Exciting money often leads to a tiring life. The seventh sign is that ownership language replaces excuse language. This one matters because language reveals posture. The person quietly getting rich starts speaking differently. He stops saying, "I cannot." He starts saying, "That is not a priority." He stops saying, "The economy made me do this." He starts asking, "What is still within my control?" He stops using hardship as a script that explains every failure and starts treating constraints as problems to be worked around. Now, I am not naive. Constraints are real. Rent can be too high. Wages can be too low. Student debt can bite hard. Health can turn against you. The economy can treat entire groups unfairly for very long stretches. I do not deny any of that. But there is a great divide between acknowledging constraints and building your identity around them. The first is realism. The second is surrender. I have always respected people who work the problem in front of them. The income may have been modest, the city expensive, the starting point unimpressive, but they adjusted what they could. Roommates, simpler housing, meal prep, no car when a bike or train would do, extra work, fewer excuses. More ownership. This mindset is not glamorous. It does not get much applause because it is too practical to be romantic, but it is one of the clearest internal signals that a person is changing financially. He is no longer waiting for conditions to become fair before he behaves intelligently. He is acting within the conditions that exist. That is powerful, very powerful, because once you own your financial reality instead of merely narrating it, money starts behaving differently around you, not magically, mechanically. Better choices compound, bad habits lose their script. The future stops waiting for perfect conditions and begins being built from imperfect ones. The eighth sign is the strangest and perhaps the most important. You no longer need to feel rich in order to act like a wealthy person. This is the hidden reversal that almost nobody explains. The public thinks action follows feeling, feel rich, then save, feel secure, then invest, feel ahead, then think long term. In truth, almost everything good in finance works the other way. You act first, the feeling comes later, often much later, and sometimes it arrives so quietly that by the time you notice it, you have already become a different sort of person. That is what makes quiet wealth so powerful. It changes you before it fully announces itself. You become calmer before you become visibly richer. You become less reactive before the account looks impressive. You become more selective before the lifestyle changes. You become more patient before the compounding curve becomes obvious. That sequence is easy to miss if you keep looking for fireworks. Most people miss it. That is why they quit too early or overspend too quickly. They are waiting for a jackpot moment, and quiet wealth is not a jackpot moment. It is an identity shift. It is the slow installation of a different relationship to enough, to time, to attention, to pressure, to other people, choices, to your own excuses, and finally to the future itself. That future stops looking like a place where disaster is always hiding one paycheck away. It starts looking like something you are building. That is the best definition of wealth I know, not how rich you can look. How much of your future has become self-directed. I have met plenty of people with large incomes who never reached that stage. Their lives remain performances. More money simply financed a larger costume department. I have met others with much more modest means who reached it surprisingly early because their margin was real, their priorities were clear, and their money habits were no longer controlled by applause. That is why I want you to use a different scoreboard. Do not ask only whether your net worth feels big enough yet. Ask whether you need to impress less. Ask whether your raises are reaching your assets. Ask whether you compare less. Ask whether emergencies have lost some of their power to terrify you. Ask whether money now speaks more quietly in your life because the systems are doing their job. Ask whether your time feels less constantly sold. Ask whether your language sounds more like ownership than blame. Ask whether the future feels less like a threat and more like a project. If even a few of those things are becoming true, you are probably getting rich in the way that matters, not loudly, correctly. And that is exactly how I would want it to happen.